Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. Welcome to the second PRCA leadership lesson of 2022, organised by the PRCA's Equity and Inclusion Advisory Council. My name's David, and I'm a member of the council, and specifically its gender workstream. So it's lovely to have you all here. Before we kick off, just a few housekeeping things. If you could all keep yourselves on mute and keep your video turned off, then that means there'll be no untoward interruptions and kind of Ellie and I can have a good chat. We'll have a Q&A session though towards the end. So if you can hold your questions until then, that would be fantastic. But if you want to drop any comments just to kind of add on to anything that Ellie or I talk about, then feel free to put them in the chat. A brief intro to the Equity and Advisory Council. Our aim is to help build an inclusive communications industry so that it visibly reflects the societies that we operate in. With regards to gender, this means creating a culture that enables women and non-binary people to thrive throughout their career. Throughout their career is kind of the key phrase there. While 65% of people working in communications are women, at leadership level, that number actually drops down to 33%. So one way that the gender work stream is going to create such a culture is to raise awareness really of the barriers faced by women in our industry throughout their careers, and find ways through personal experiences and practical guidance on how to overcome such barriers. That's the main thinking behind these leadership lessons, to give a platform to women in leadership roles to share their expertise and experiences so that we can all learn from that and help to collaborate and build that culture that we want. So that leads me on to introducing Ellie Dobson, who is going to be talking with me today. Ellie's the Director of Science, Engineering and Innovation at the agency April 6, and we'll be chatting about flexible working and personal branding, two important areas that have already been discussed in previous leadership lessons, so we'll be going into a little bit more detail on those. Ellie's recognised as one of Europe's leading voices in communicating science and innovation and works with some of the brightest organisations in the world to help them effectively engage with their audiences. However, beyond the science and engineering sector, Ellie's also a regular expert speaker on cutting-edge approaches to communications, to measuring and evaluating communications. There we go. And she's also a champion for diverse, equitable, and supportive workplaces. So, hello, Ellie, and thank you for giving us your time.
No, not at all. Pleasure.
Yeah, we'll get started with flexible working. So I'm going to start with the big question, really, the pandemic. How has it changed flexible working for you? What were you doing before, and what is it now? What's your kind of day-to-day experience of it?
Sure. Well, I guess a bit of context. My experience of flexible working really started when I had my son. So I have a 5-year-old boy. So he was pre-pandemic. And at that time, I realised I was living in sort of Greater London and commuting into town every day to be in the office. And it just became apparent that that was going to be really challenging because our nursery was going to close at 6 o'clock and it was impossible for me to get home. And so I opened up this whole can of, right, I need some flexible working options here. I was very fortunate that I'd already been at the company for a while. So it wasn't, I think you already have a sort of a strong relationship with your manager and you already know a lot about the culture of the company, and it's easier to have a conversation around that. So I was very fortunate. They were extremely supportive and said, whatever I need, we'll agree, an arrangement that suits, that won't have a damaging effect on the business. So I think what we ended up putting in place pre-pandemic was what I sort of now reflectively consider to be a bit more of like a rigid, flexible working. So I think you've got truly flexible working, which we're moving towards now. And I think you've got rigid flexible working. And what I mean by that is where you agree your flexible terms and then they become set in stone. So they're flexible as in they're not necessarily the 9 to 5, but then they are still very rigid. So that's what I had pre-pandemic. We agreed I would leave, come in early and leave the office a little bit early twice a week, and I'd work from home 1 day a week, and that meant that I could pick up my son and stuff like that. So that was great, and it really worked for me. And at the time, it actually felt quite groundbreaking. And then the pandemic happened, and suddenly the whole world went home, and we all realized, I mean, something I was always really keen on working from home. It worked really well for me, but I think it obviously gave everyone the opportunity to see if it worked for them, and it doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but for people with kids I think it's particularly beneficial. And I think it's kind of enabled us to move a bit more towards what I was talking about, and being a bit more truly flexible working. So I think, like, the pandemic, to me, I think it broke down that rigid assumption that, you know, where you work matters, that if you're in the office, you know, that's the number one, that's the plan A. And I think because the pandemic kind of threw that on its head, I think it's inevitable that that's actually also helped people to see that when you work, it also kind of doesn't really matter if you're in an output-based industry, which PR, of course, you know, generally speaking, it is very much so. You don't clock on at 9 and clock off at 5. It's all output-led. So I think that's been really helpful in making quite a lot of ground. And I personally certainly feel like I have moved much more towards truly flexible working now. You know, I think it's really shone a light on people's health and well-being, and the impact of our working patterns and working lives, and flexibility being actually really essential to help people. And I think it's also broken down a few barriers between kind of more senior members of the team, because I think, you know, it's introduced a lot of people's kids into their workplaces. So, you know, for the first time, a lot of people might have had to actually talk about and admit that they're having some school or childcare issues, because when they closed, everybody had nothing to do with their children except exist in the same, you know, home office. And some of them have literally appeared on Zoom calls. I mean, I've had my son appear on more than I can count, just his little face cropping up in the background. But I think that's actually in some ways quite a good thing, because we all sort of see each other as a little bit more human than I think maybe we used to. And that empathy that you get from that, I think it really contributes to the trust that is absolutely fundamental to flexible working. You know, if you trust your team to deliver what they are responsible for delivering, then you can trust them to do it on their own terms. Yeah, I think it's definitely moving in the right direction for me. I think it's happening more broadly, but it's difficult, of course. Yeah, I've been at the same agency for almost a decade, so slightly limited experience there.
Yes, you make a very good point about PR being an output-based industry, and the idea of presenteeism does seem to be slowly moving away, accelerated by the pandemic. You make an interesting point by the fact that you've been at your agency for quite a while. So you've kind of been able to have the conversations with kind of the other members of the leadership team to help you kind of build out that sort of structure. It can be probably a bit trickier to negotiate if you're a newer member of staff, or you're less senior. How do you think newer members of staff should go around doing that, sort of building up that social capital, I think?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. It's really challenging if you don't have that fundamental trust there in the first place. And it also obviously will depend on the type of workplace and the culture that already exists. If you are a trailblazer, so to speak, in that you are asking for something that isn't already in place, I think that can be really challenging if you're new or you're in a more junior position. But what I would certainly encourage would be just having an open conversation, you know, approaching it constructively, speaking to your boss or your boss's boss about what you want, what you need, but not just on your own terms. So why is that going to be beneficial for you and for the business? Because it will be, because if you're able to actually integrate your working life and deliver what you're responsible for on your own terms, I genuinely believe that you will be a happier, more productive, and probably a longer term employee than you would be if you were trying to squeeze this seemingly impossible task into your life and it's not fitting. And I think if you're a valued employee, that should be taken seriously, and you should be able to have that open conversation. And I think even if you are junior, it really says something about you if you're willing to actually set up that conversation and make it a two-way thing. Ask about how does your boss find our current working practices. I think just being really open about it would be really helpful. And yeah, just definitely not coming across like it's just a take thing. I think thinking about it from the business perspective and actually why that might be beneficial at times would be really helpful.
You mentioned kind of if your workplace is not the most forward thinking. It sounds like you've done quite a lot of work at April 6 to kind of really sort of make them one of the trailblazers. Series of benefits. Do you want to go into a little bit more about actually kind of what you've managed to get implemented there?
Yeah, I guess so as I say, when I first, back in the day, so it would have been 5 years ago, when I had my son, nobody really worked very flexibly. And so I think I was an account director at the time, so I was still relatively senior. But I had to open that conversation up with my boss, and make that work for me. And I was really pleased with how well that went and how they embraced that. But it wasn't the norm. It did, I did feel like I was asking for a favor, and I was always conscious of, I hated it every time I had to get up from my desk at 4:45 p.m. and leave my team there while I went off home, looking like I was just, I felt like I would be judged, oh, the slacker. I'm sure that wasn't the case, but you're very conscious of it. And if you're the only one doing it, that can be really difficult. So I think that experience has made it really important to me to make sure that nobody else feels that way. And there's this leadership concept that I talk about a lot with my team, actually. It's called the shadow of the leader concept. And it's basically talks about the unconscious influence of a manager, of a boss. And the idea is that people will absorb that leader's values, and they also tend to mirror their behavior. So in that sort of within that shadow that you're casting. And I believe it's been helpful for my team to see me embracing those sorts of flexible elements. And I actually really think that can be one of the most powerful tools for businesses to actually have their leadership team set the tone to embrace that themselves. One of the best things for me has been having an MD who he also has kids, and he ducks out for the school run sometimes. And I don't doubt that he's still putting in the hours. So why would anyone doubt my commitment if my Slack status slides to away, or my actually working from the gym that day because that suits my life better. Nobody's actually judging me because I'm not judging my boss, and we're sort of setting that tone. So a lot of what I think the impact that I've had on our business has actually been not through fixed kind of schemes or programs or working models. It's actually been much more cultural than that. I head up a division, so I have a whole team who, we have a relative amount of sort of autonomy in the way that we work as a team, and very much I think we really embrace good working practices, flexible working practices. I was the first in my team to default my Slack notifications to go off after 6 p.m. and I encouraged actively, and still do, all of my team to do that if they want to. I do that. I respect my boundaries, and I really want you to respect your boundaries too. There have been a lot of initiatives that we have also rolled out. So very recently we've done a whole new raft of benefits, and some of them do kind of relate to flexible working. So my favorite one, which I suggested, was every week now we're giving everyone in the team an hour to just take for themselves and do something that's important to them. So whatever it is, whether it's spending an extra hour with your child, whether it's reading a book, whether it's actually pursuing a passion project or something that might be related to work, a training, it can be anything. And it doesn't need approval. We trust them to schedule that at a time that's appropriate, and it's sending a real message of work has to work for you too, and we trust you. And I think things like that are so important to actually, as I said, kind of set that tone. I think as leaders, that's really the most important thing that we can do, and something that I've certainly tried to do. I mean, it's come easily for me because I needed to embrace flexible working. I think it would be more difficult if you were a leader who actually really preferred working 9 to 5 in the office. And let's face it, some people do. The whole point of flexible working is that it's meant to be whatever suits you, what you need on your terms. And for some people, that old traditional model would be the plan A still. But if you're a leader, I think you have to be very conscious of how that comes across, and again, open up a conversation around it, that this is actually how I prefer to work because it helps me with my boundaries, or, whatever the reasons are that you prefer working in the office, but to actually have that conversation and say, I don't expect that of you just because I do it, I think is really important.
I just want to go back to the shadow of the leadership, the shadow of the leader concept. I think we were chatting about this before. I think it's a perfect encapsulation of how workplaces sometimes work. You see how others behave who are more senior to you, and you just think that's how it is.
Very good, yeah.
What point did you kind of learn and start to understand that was a concept, and therefore kind of start to change how you yourself were seen in the agency?
Yeah, so a really specific one, actually. I went on a leadership training course that a lot of our senior team went on a few years ago. And, it was one of those usual sort of teaching. It was a 2-day course. It was quite intense, and I probably didn't take that much away from it. But the shadow of the leader just really stuck with me, because I'd never, on my way up the ladder, so to speak, I'd not really thought about the impact that I had on other people. And it really made me think, not beyond flexible working, but even just, working practices and the way that you speak to people, the way that you, the processes that you put in place, and actually thinking about how other people perceive that, rather than, I think, as you're working your way up, you're sort of more concentrating on what you're doing and your work and your career. And then when you get into a leadership position, actually that needs to turn on its head, and you are there to enable others. And so that was a real turning point for me in thinking about the impact that I have on other people. And it's made me really try to kind of adjust some of my approaches. So I fight quite hard to not always believe that I'm right and to embrace other people's perspectives. And because when I was on the way up, I was very much I was sort of fighting to prove myself. So you have to get behind your ideas and your opinions, and you really kind of enforce them, if you like. And then it just, now I've really tried to change that and not be so focused on what I have to offer, because I'm my role as a leader is now first and foremost, not actually how I might have written that press release differently, or
yes, it's interesting chatting about your kind of journey from being a manager up to a director of a division. On a previous call, we sort of chatted about the importance of having authority or gravitas. What's your take on that in your experience going from, especially in one company?
Yeah, so I've been at this company for 9 years. which is a long time. I joined as an account manager and I've had incredible opportunities here. The company itself has changed a lot as well. So I should caveat that I actually joined a company called Proof Communication, which then became April 6 Proof and has now fully merged with April 6. So it's a slightly different beast, and it was tiny when I joined as well. So there's been a lot of different cultures and changes in leadership above me as well. So I have had a few opportunities to sort of actually have a bit more of a blank slate than you might assume within one company. But nonetheless, going from an account manager to a divisional director in, you know, the space of a few years was no mean feat in terms of how I had to adapt my style. And I think the idea of gravitas and authority is such an interesting issue. I think there's so much talk about being authentic, and I really do believe that, and that there is a huge value in being your sort of authentic self. But at the same time, I work in science and engineering, which is quite a conservative and quite a male-dominated sector. So for me, I do feel it's appropriate for me to adapt my style a bit, which might be controversial. I mean, I do say, you know, you have a bit of a game face when you're in a client-facing business. If you work in an agency, you naturally have to adapt to different client personalities, you know, no matter what sector you're in. I think that's actually just being a good client service person. But as a leader, I think there's a big difference between that external person, facing your industry and adapting your approach to that. And then there's your internal role as a leader, where I think that authenticity is really paramount. Yeah, I think it's difficult, you know, externally, I've always felt that I already stand out as the young-ish blonde woman, and I have felt over the years that I've had to work harder to overcome people's initial assumptions. You know, they might have assumed when I come into the room that I'm there as somebody's PA, and then you see the shock as they realize that I'm actually the most senior person in the room. And that's hard. It's hard, you know, it's important to be yourself, but I don't necessarily want to add, you know, my sparkling personality and witty banter into that melting pot of things that are already making me stand out in that room. And when you're also representing either your agency or your client as a senior person, sometimes the most senior person, you know, their credibility is my responsibility. So I do think that, you know, you have to take that seriously. But the internal brand, I think, is different.
You've also had one client across that whole amount of time. So talk about that external brand. How has that experience been?
Yeah.
Has it been tricky?
Yeah. So when I first joined as an account manager, I was given a client that we had just won, and I was so excited to work on it. And it became my baby as my account manager. You know, they used to joke about building me a desk in their own office, and, you know, it was one of those client relationships that was just fundamental to my enjoyment of the job. And we still have them as a client, and it's been really strange to not just have to adapt my style and be accepted by them, because some of them are still, you know, the same client contacts, to be accepted as the senior point of the agency when I used to be the day-to-day, I think has been not as difficult as you might imagine, but I think it has definitely had to grow organically. You know, when you get a promotion, if you go from, you know, let's say senior account manager to account director, your role doesn't immediately change overnight. You don't suddenly reinvent yourself with this brand new profile, but you do need to actually consciously think about the type of leader that you want to be, and start to try to really embrace that, I think. But yeah, with this one client, it has been really interesting, and I have outlived a lot of our client contacts there, so that's been interesting as well, that we have such a history there. It's been good, but I think also handing over to other people within our team has been difficult, because when you're so attached to a client and you live and breathe everything they do, and then you become more senior and it's not appropriate for me to be that person anymore. And it's hard to let go and give that to someone else who might approach it differently. But it's all part of learning, isn't it? And learning to take on more of a leadership role that you are there to enable others.
So you're obviously director of the Engineering, Science and Innovation team. We've already talked about, or briefly mentioned, the male-dominated nature of that industry. How is it changing? And if so, how?
I do think it's changing. It's definitely still a male-dominated sector, but it's becoming a lot more normal to see women in leadership roles, which is fantastic. I mean, the client that I was just referring to, they now, when I started working with them, they had a male president and a male CEO, and they have since had a female CEO and a female president, which is amazing. Yeah, I think it's growing a bit beyond the tick box exercise now of involving a woman, but it's definitely still male dominated.
How do you think it can change it? As you say, kind of, it's not a tick box exercise anymore. So, has it kind of reached that point where it will just naturally start to feed back positively?
I think so. I think it's just a slow burn, isn't it, over time? You know, part of our role as PR people is to make sure that all of our communications and our clients are representative externally, and I think it's just going to take time.
Yeah, that's often kind of one of the things that that I think, like, are we all expecting change to happen too quickly, and simply actually is this, you know, are these things kind of years long, decades long until we actually kind of achieve real parity? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I completely think so. You know, we can't just like internally reinventing yourself, I think culturally is an even slower burn. You know, we're not going to decide that we want to be a more diverse and equitable industry and then make it happen overnight. And, you know, it's challenging because working in science and engineering, obviously we want to make sure that we are representing a diverse, you know, workforce in our clients' comms, but that's actually sometimes really difficult because you know, it's chicken and egg, isn't it? We have to actually have the diverse people working within that workforce to be able to showcase them. And actually, you know, when I first started my career, that was like a needle in a haystack job to find people who we wanted to be out there representing. And it is getting easier, but it's just the sheer volume of, you know, people that are needed to help kind of showcase that. I would also use an example, I guess, of just before Christmas, I took part in an event that April 6th hosted, and it was on science policy, and it was a really interesting event, just a small panel, and I was a speaker alongside three extremely distinguished men, older than me, all white, and but, you know, very, very well placed to be talking on this topic, you know, absolutely very credible speakers. Now, we had a little bit of discussion internally about whether I should be on the panel, because it's a topic I know, but policy is not my forte. And we do have a policy specialist who's the same, you know, who's at director level, who probably would have, you know, arguably been a more better placed spokesperson on that panel than I might have been, but he is a man. And so we decided that I would take part in the event so that it was more representative. But I still don't know whether that was the right course of action, because you could argue that that's actually putting me at even more at a disadvantage, because I wasn't as credible a speaker as the other three because it's not my area. But was it better to have a diverse panel? I still don't know the answer to that, really, but it was interesting to take part in that and to kind of mull it over myself.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the positive discrimination, I think, is still a topic that you can just have so many discussions about whether it's right or wrong or not. Yeah, it's an incredibly tricky one. I'd like to just briefly touch on the work that you're doing yourself in April 6 as a champion of diverse, equitable and supportive workplaces. You mentioned some brief kind of informal benefits that you guys have introduced, but what do you do specifically? What do you think of as a particularly important things that leaders can do, workplaces can do to really improve their workplaces for the better?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a diversity and inclusion commitment within April 6 and as part of our parent group, the mission, which is taken very seriously. And it's been really beneficial to me in providing me with quite a lot of training, and it's made me much more aware of my role as an individual. You know, I take my role in recruitment very seriously. When I'm recruiting for my team and I'm interviewing, I have to be so aware of my own unconscious biases. And, you know, there are multiple perspectives that can bring something to our agency that, you know, I might not have experienced before. And I have to be open-minded to that because I've always worked in this, you know, relatively white dominated sector. So we do a lot in terms of, you know, day to day, making sure that everything we do is rooted in, you know, the right perspectives and open-minded. And, you know, of course, we follow our D&I policy to the letter. But I think, you know, a lot of what I do personally is more on the end of creating supportive workplaces, and that's supportive workplaces for anyone and everyone, and that being, you know, equal for all. So, you know, being part of our senior leadership team now, it's been a great opportunity for me to put forward ideas and make sure that, you know, we are doing absolutely everything we can to help people and make sure that people are actually benefiting from everything that we have, because sometimes our company's grown so much in the last few years, and I think we have so many benefits now and policies and initiatives, which is fantastic, but sometimes I think new people might come in and not even be aware of it all. So kind of, again, making sure that as leaders we're actually demonstrating that this is available and talking about it and you know, talking about it openly to the whole team, you know, not just in one-to-ones, because the people that we have one-to-ones with are most likely to be more senior, or, you know, just having that kind of awareness and yeah, making sure that everyone is equally well supported is probably the area that I contribute the most in.
Again, you touched on the shadow of the leader concept there. It stems from the top downwards. If that environment is not created by the leaders, then it's very, very hard to actually create it, no matter how many different policies or things that you put in place.
Yeah, I mean that policy that I was talking, not policy, but benefit that I was talking about earlier, about the taking a moment each week, an hour each week to, you know, do whatever you want. You know, the first thing I said when we agreed it was going to roll out was, you know, to the more senior members of the team, like, please make sure that you take it. You take it. Like, I have to take it. I take it every week, and I change my Slack notification and my Slack emoji, and I tell everyone I'm taking my hour, and it's in my diary, and I want everyone to see that that's not just a piece of paper. That's not just a, you know, a recruitment drive. Though I was saying what a great workplace this is. This is real. We want you to take it. I'm taking it. Because I think otherwise you announce something like that, and if you're new or you're junior and you haven't seen anyone else do it, you're not going to do it. So I just think it's so important.
And part of that is all about male allyship as well, which is, again, a topic we've discussed on this. And Tiffany's put a question in the group saying, how do we get more men involved in championing gender equality so that this change can happen a little bit quicker than it is happening at the moment?
I mean, that's a great question. And I would actually turn that onto you, Dave, because you have obviously taken up that mantle. So what motivated you to join the group?
I think it just knowing, well, I suppose male guilt probably. I mean, I'm a bit of a textbook example of privilege. I'm white, I'm male, I'm middle class, I'm grammar school educated. Like I have had no particular barriers in kind of achieving what I've wanted to in my career so far, and just I couldn't really, I don't think I could look myself in the mirror if I thought I did not get involved and actually try to affect change in some way. I mean, I don't know kind of how that is for other men out there, but kind of, yeah, I just feel like the privileges that I have kind of mean that I almost have to get involved. Otherwise, I am part of the problem. I kind of do agree with that. I think if you aren't getting involved and you're not raising your voice, then you might as well just kind of side with, you know, sort of gender inequality or any other subject that you feel passionate about. Yeah,
that's really
why I'm here.
Do you feel that you've gained, sorry, I'm turning into interviewer now.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you've gained anything personally from it other than just slightly lessened your feelings of guilt?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, it's definitely broadened my horizons of the experiences of women in the workplace. I mean, just these leadership lessons alone, kind of the opinions and thoughts that are shared by a lot of people they're now things that I kind of take on and also raise and discuss with friends down the pub. And actually there was one of the last one that I really enjoyed, that was kind of if people are still asking you what the benefit of gender equality is or feminism, then there's no point in even chatting to that person, because they still need to be convinced. It's definitely just raised kind of a lot more questions and things to consider that otherwise I wouldn't have considered. And I think I'm still kind of sort of fairly open-minded, but there were still elements that I am unaware of. So just that alone, I think, is helping me just to do this and continue to kind of be a male ally, I think. But yeah, I don't know how to get more men on board who maybe aren't kind of quite as involved in feminism or that side of things. Actually, no, I do. I think just men who are just need to speak up. Like they need to pick out things that they don't agree with or don't think are right. Even if they might be afraid or otherwise. Yeah. And I think you kind of see examples of that around quite a lot. And I think it is slowly changing, but again, it's not changing as much as I would like, I think.
Yeah. Maybe we should have you doing an interview on the PRCA and showcase that.
Maybe. If there's any other questions coming out there for Ellie or for me, apparently, then please do put them in the chat. Actually, there's one, Ellie, that I have. You talked about introducing training. What does that look like? Kind of where I work has just started rolling out quite a lot of sort of EDI sessions, which have been quite confronting, actually, kind of putting you together with your colleagues to talk about times that you've been discriminated, and they're quite tough. And I can imagine, especially for a leadership team, they might actually be even trickier. You know, sort of times where you might have recruited someone and there's quite a lot of biases involved in that. Yeah, what kind of training is April 6 rolling out?
Yeah, so there's various levels. There's like ongoing training around, rather than recruitment focus, more sort of internal. We have a much more structured appraisal program these days, and every year there's an annual reflection, and the idea is that everyone is sort of effectively calibrated against their equivalent levels in the rest of the business, because that helps to avoid, my judgment of one of my account managers might be different to the judgment of a different divisional director and one of their account managers. So rather than just running our own divisional appraisals, we'll do that, and then we'll come together to discuss and compare the, subjective, arguably, judgments that we might have made, and make sure that actually they're as objective as possible and that they're fair across the business. So we've had a lot of training around that, that whole sort of calibration process as a senior leadership team. And I think that that's been extremely beneficial in making sure that there's that rigor, because I think there is a danger with internal HR, appraisals particularly, that if your visibility is low, if you're only reporting into one or two people, that it's their opinions that will determine your career. So I think that's been really important. And then we've also been running a more more structured, it sounds very similar to yours actually, EDI series, which just the senior leadership team have undertaken so far, because it's brand new and it's being custom built for our group of agencies. And it's been really fascinating. And each session, I think there's 4 sessions, and each one is 2.5 to 3 hours long. So they're really, this is not light touch tick box exercise. This is a proper discussion. And as you say, bringing people together from across the business who might not have much exposure to each other usually, and actually talking about very personal experiences, and sort of inviting us to perform exercises where we're checking our privilege and we're considering what we mean by these terms. And it's very valuable and very interesting from a self-reflection perspective as well. So I'm looking forward to that. That's being rolled out across our business in the next few months, which is, brilliant.
Okay. Magdalene has asked if you can recommend any specific courses or tools that you found useful to grow as a leader. Is there anything that over your time at April 6 you've really benefited from, or not benefited from equally?
That is a good question. Well, I'm all about the shadow of the leader concept, as you can tell. So I would definitely recommend going away and doing some Googling around that. So the main courses that I have done at leadership level have been, we've had an external consultant come and train a group of our leaders at the same time. And we've had like real sort of double down, like full day sessions and things like that, which have been great. But one thing I have observed from that is that it's not necessarily what you are learning. Yes, you'll pick up the odd model that you like the shadow of the leader concept, or other sort of leadership models or practical ideas that you might implement. But mostly it's just self-reflection. It's really thinking about how you are as a leader, what comes naturally to you, and where your strengths are, and thinking about the impact that you have on others. And it's really that I have found has actually matured my thinking in my approach as a leader. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, there's this great MBA, or, you should, look up this, that, or the other. I actually think that so much of it is just taking the time out of your working day. Taking 2 solid days out of work is no mean feat, but to actually just spend some time exploring the concept of leadership and thinking about the kind of leader that you want to be is the best way to actually have that then manifest over the longer period.
In the chat, Siddha also makes a very good point about not having to make the choice between work and childcare. It sounds like pre-pandemic, you were able to arrange it, but it did sound like you were kind of also having to make that choice about trying to juggle it in a way that, frankly, kind of is a bit ridiculous, really.
It was very difficult, actually. And I really felt that, and I still feel this, that the world is just not set up for working mothers or fathers, frankly. Like our nursery. So I lived in London and I worked in London, and our nursery closed at 6 p.m. and our working hours were supposed to run until 5:30, and half an hour was nowhere near enough for me to get back. And it's just so impractical. And then only more recently, thankfully for me, it's been post-pandemic. My son has started school. I honestly don't know how people would have managed without working from home. And, you know, my partner benefits from the same flexible working that I do. And between us, we managed to make it work, but it's very difficult. And it feels more difficult than it should be. And I mean, don't get me started on the cost of childcare either, which basically, you know, it disincentivizes women to go back to the workplace for years, which is terrible.
Yeah, you make a very good point about male take up of paternity leave as well, which I think I'm not 100% sure of the numbers, but does seem to be a shockingly low amount, which needs to change, I think.
Yeah.
If anyone else has any questions, now's the time to ask them. So I'll give a few seconds for people to put those into the chat. But if not, I think it might be time to round up, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, cool. I'm not seeing any more questions. No raised hands. Well, thank you very much, Ellie, for taking the time.
No, not at all. Thank you for letting me talk about myself for an hour. That was another bit of self-reflection for my lead.
Brilliant. And I hope everyone else joining us has taken away from something from this and really enjoyed the chat. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for the PRCA for organising. And yeah, keep an eye out for the next leadership lesson. Thank you everyone. Goodbye.